Welcome back. So this week we're picking back up Victor Frankenstein's narrative after we've heard the creature give an account of his survival in the wilderness as well as his self-education at the DeLacy's cottage. We see that Victor has decided, for better or for worse, to build the creature a female companion. He talks about feeling bound to the creature to fulfill his request. In places he refers to it as a solemn promise. This shows us that at least now he's accepting responsibility for what he's done. He knows that he can't move on with his life until he's resolved his business with the creature once and forever. But it's interesting to see what this solemn promise has done to Victor's mental state. He no longer feels like a free man. He feels like the creature's slave. And again, I would draw a comparison between this and someone who has an unhealthy obsession or even an addiction. You get to a certain point where even if you want to quit, you can't. You're no longer in control of yourself. You're a slave to what's constantly occupying your thoughts. This is what the Apostle Paul talks about in the book of Romans. He says that we're that person's servant to whom we yield ourselves servants to obey, and that before we're made free by Christ, we're servants to sin. We're slaves to sin. And being in this state makes it so that we can't live our lives as we may otherwise want to. And for example, Victor wants to marry Elizabeth, but he knows that he can't until he's taken care of this other commitment first that he would much rather be free of if he could help it. And it also makes him feel isolated and cut off from his family and from the beauty of the world around him. In these chapters, his thoughts are becoming increasingly gloomy and fatalistic. He's on this continental tour with Clerval, and he's trying to have a moment of tranquility here or there amongst the beautiful scenery and getting to know the locals, but it's not really working. Victor feels cut off from the rest of humanity. This is, ironically, how the creature himself feels, at least as he's described in his narrative. He's an outcast. There's a barrier between him and the rest of mankind. Victor describes this barrier like this. I could fill my mind with the sights of heaven and earth. The voice of Henry soothed me, and I could thus cheat myself into a transitory peace. But busy, uninteresting, joyous faces brought back despair to my heart. I saw an insurmountable barrier placed between me and my fellow men. This barrier was sealed with the blood of William and Justine, and to reflect on the events connected with those names filled my soul with anguish. So in this sense, the creature has already enacted a form of retaliation against Victor. He's dragged him down to his level, so now he's an outcast too. Anyway, while he's on this tour with Clerval, and it's almost described as a sort of very long extended bachelor party, he's having it right before his wedding to see the world before he settles down. Victor starts visiting other scientists in these countries, natural philosophers he calls them. He says that he needs to talk with them to learn a few things for his new project that he's conducting. Mary Shelley doesn't indicate here which of the sort of natural philosophers she had in mind, but from other clues in the novel we could probably venture a guess. The preface of the novel has already made reference to one, Dr. Darwin. This would be Erasmus Darwin, the grandfather of the more famous Charles Darwin. She might have also had someone in mind like William Lawrence, who we've also mentioned before in past lectures. He was a friend of Percy Shelley's. We've also talked about French thinkers like Jean-Baptiste Lamarck in passing last week. But now I want to take some time to look at the contributions of these various men in depth, because they all, in their own way, were influential on Charles Darwin when he was developing his theory of evolution in the 1850s. And evolution was one of the major upheavals of the 19th century, with ripples running right through into the 20th century as well. Remember that one of the themes of this class is how those in the 19th century are trying to set aside traditional notions of the world, of morality and of God, and raising up new, often untested ideas in their place. And the idea of evolution, even setting aside its merits or lack of merits as a scientific hypothesis entirely, help these new thinkers to dismiss God, to dismiss the scriptures, and to dismiss our understanding of mankind as creatures created in God's image. So Erasmus Darwin was someone who was rather infamous for his libertine lifestyle and radical political views. Someone who Mary's father, William Godwin, may have admired, and they may have even run in the same circles. He was a natural philosopher whose most famous work was a book called Zoonomia. In that book, he actually anticipated most of the ideas that his grandson would later make famous, although Charles would often deny that his grandfather's ideas had any influence on his own work. This was probably because Charles wanted to distance himself from the infamous radical Grandpa Erasmus. The book laid out the idea that characteristics or traits that we acquire in our own lives can be passed down to succeeding generations. It also put forward the idea of natural selection, which Charles later declared to be the key mechanism in evolution. It was the theory that individual species in a given environment or ecosystem that have adaptive traits are more likely to survive and reproduce than those who do not have those adaptive traits. This wasn't an idea that was unique to the Darwins or unique to the field of science. Similar ideas were already being espoused by economists, such as Thomas Malthus, who we'll talk about in more detail in a future lecture. His idea is that there is a struggle for existence in nature and in human populations. And this wasn't so much a scientific theory as a socio-economic theory that Charles later co-opted for his own purposes when he was writing The Origin of Species. It's a theory that by now has been largely debunked, but still has some adherents in the modern day. Malthus's idea is that as human populations grow and the available total resources remain the same, a catastrophe will ensue when the population outnumbers the goods and means to sustain them. We see this philosophy at work in movies like Marvel's The Avengers. The villain, Thanos, is operating under the assumption that he's preventing a Malthusian catastrophe on a universal scale by committing planet-wide genocides to keep the population leveled. Charles Darwin's real breakthrough wasn't so much a scientific observation as it was a combination of Malthusian philosophy with natural selection as described by his grandpa. It was largely a speculative theory. If there is only a limited amount of resources, then the various species dependent on them are going to have to be adaptive in order to get their fair share as the populations grow larger and larger. Those quick-witted adaptive species then survive and thrive, while those who weren't so lucky miss out on the resources and go extinct. This, in turn, keeps the population of the species low, so that the Malthusian catastrophe never happens. This is the idea of survival of the fittest. We see the Darwin's thinking set apart from a natural philosopher like Lamarck, which again we talked about last week. It's set apart because Lamarck thought that species adapted or evolved toward being better fitted for survival, as if the intention to survive spurred on the adaptive traits necessary to do so. Darwin thought that these adaptive traits arose at random and survival was the natural but unsought consequence of their arising. Now, all of these thinkers were what we might call naturalists, though many would have claimed at the time to have been deists. They sought for explanations as to the cause of things in the material world. And this made their theories lend themselves well to utilization by material thinkers in other fields aside from natural science, in economics and politics, and in philosophy. Many use their ideas about mankind just being another animal to justify treating others not as fellow human beings possessing a spark of the divine, to use Dostoevsky's phrase, but as merely means to an end. The mid-1800s saw the cheapening of human life, where working conditions in Victorian England were horrid and led to disease and early death, as depicted in novels such as Charles Dickens's Hard Times and Elizabeth Gaskell's North and South. At the same time, we get glimpses of how little human life was held in regard in Siberian prison camps from Russian authors like Dostoevsky, as well as later Alexander Solzhenitsyn. But the consequences of a materialistic evolutionary approach to the world and to people lasted much longer than the 19th century itself. One of these consequences was the rise of what's known as social Darwinism, whose greatest advocate was Adolf Hitler in Nazi Germany. Apply the ideas of survival of the fittest and limited resources to human beings, as well as a good amount of national pride amounting to nation worship, and you come up with something like Hitler's worldview. If all the races of mankind are in competition for the means of survival, then some of them will naturally have those adaptive traits that make them better than others, and this was Hitler's idea of the German race. For them to wipe out what they considered to be inferior races is just fulfilling the dictates of evolution. The strong survive, and for the weak to die off is a natural consequence. And Hitler wasn't the only person who thought along these lines. He was just the most well-known, and still is today. Another consequence of evolutionary thought was, ironically, the rise of a worldview and a system that would prove to be bitter enemies of Hitler and his Nazis, and that would be communism. Communism is a system that views the world through a strictly material lens and seeks to solve its ills through strictly material means. Now, as Christians, we know that the world's problems can't be solved without reference to God and His will. When we try to, disaster ensues, and communist nations like the Soviet Union are good examples of that. Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels, the originators of communism, saw a Darwinian evolution as a scientific justification for their materialist worldview. Marx actually wanted to dedicate his famous book, Das Kapital, to Darwin, but Darwin said no. Again, Charles Darwin was rather circumspect about distancing himself from controversial figures. None of this really was anticipated or planned by Darwin himself. But again, the idea of evolution, or rather, maybe we should say the mindset of evolution, had a much larger impact on the world in both the 19th and the 20th centuries than any of the specific scientific theories he espoused in his books, The Origin of Species and the Descent of Man. This long digression is all to say that in a century where people were replacing God with other things to live for, perhaps the state, like in the French Revolution or in Nazi Germany, or perhaps for concepts of the greater good or the maximization of human happiness, the theory of evolution and the mindset of evolution, being a worldview that excluded God entirely, was warmly embraced by many groups for many different reasons. So coming back to Frankenstein, we see Victor seeking out these natural philosophers who, in all likelihood, have naturalistic explanations for the origins of life, and who, out of everybody, would be the most likely to pursue the study of how to instill life into an inanimate body solely through naturalistic means. And it's not clear why Victor needs more information, since he's already done this experiment once. But apparently there's something else that he needs to learn to apply to his second creature that he's about to make. And I think that we can probably conceive of Victor in this way too. The novel is vague as to how exactly he granted the first creature life. But I think it's clear that at least he thinks that he did everything through solely material, naturalistic means. But something interesting happens later in the novel. It's almost as if he knows in his heart of hearts that he's been meddling with something more than the natural materialistic world. He goes off to a remote island to build the creature's bride, and he's well on his way to doing so when one night he looks up at the window and he sees the creature leering in at him and on his progress. On a complete impulse, he's seized by strong emotions of horror and disgust, and he tears apart the nearly completed bride, scattering the parts all across the room right before the creature's eyes. And later, as he's clearing up the lab, he makes this remark. The next morning at daybreak, I summoned sufficient courage and unlocked the door of my laboratory. The remains of the half-finished creature whom I had destroyed lay scattered on the floor, and I almost felt as if I had mangled the living flesh of a human being. For a moment, then, he can't look at the mangled corpse as a science experiment on inanimate limbs. He feels a prick of his conscience, which he wouldn't feel if he didn't understand, deep down, that there's more to a human being than just their material parts. Frankenstein is an interesting novel to read in light of the ideas about evolution that were coming to prominence around the time of its composition. The premise is an evolutionary one, or at least a materialistic one, that life can be generated from strictly earthly means. But the outcome is what we would expect to find in a universe made by God. The creature has human longings, human needs, and a human desire to express language that evolution on its own can't account for. And Victor can't really account for it either. So anyway, Victor destroys the bride. He changes his mind and decides that he can't risk letting loose a new species of monsters onto the human race. And he knows that this is going to prove to be his downfall because the creature's furious, but he thinks that it's going to be a sacrifice that he has to make to protect and preserve everyone else. The creature does vow revenge, naturally, and it doesn't take too long in setting about doing so. He kills Clerval, who is nearby, and he also vows to be with Victor on his wedding night. Victor assumes that the threat is directed against himself and starts preparing for a final confrontation with the creature. Now, as readers, we get the sense that things aren't as cut and dry as Victor would like them to be. As his wedding day approaches and the sense of foreboding grows, even Elizabeth becomes despondent and seems to know that something is going to go wrong, but she just doesn't know how. But just how things go wrong, we'll leave for next week's reading. So for next time, finish reading the novel. There's just 2 more chapters of Victor's tale, and then we go back to Walton's account, and we'll go over the ending then. That'll be it.